Thank you. Tonight I would like to formally introduce the class to Miss Michelle Norris, reporter, education reporter,
General assignment.
general assignment reporter for the Chicago Tribune, who will speak to you about relationships between Chicago Tribune and school administrators. Thank you.
Okay. I thought I'd start off by telling you a little bit about myself. I'm originally from Minneapolis, and I work now for the Chicago Tribune, and I'm a general assignment reporter. And as a general assignment reporter, it means you do a little bit of everything. You cover plane crashes and school board meetings, and PTA meetings, and just about everything in between. Before coming to the Chicago Tribune, I worked for the Los Angeles Times, where I was a beat reporter. And I had a geographic beat where I covered 2 suburban communities, and I was also an education reporter for a while. So I come to this with a little bit of experience dealing with educators and school administrators. And before that, I worked in television, which is another world. I don't know how much or how different your dealings will be with television. They're reporters, and they usually have different needs because they need to get the picture in terms of stories, or in terms of, they need to get the picture on film or on video, and so they are it's a little bit harder to accommodate them. And I don't know if I should speak much to that, but I'll talk more today about dealing with the print media. I'll start by talking about press releases, because it seems like that's the most important link between the newspaper and the outside world. And as I said earlier, we depend on all of you more than you think. We can't be everywhere at once. And as much as we would like to be, and as much as we would like to give our readers the sense that we're all over the city and we have a hand in every pot, we really don't. We're based downtown, and we have 200 reporters, and we try to be, we try to cover the city as well as we can, but we really do depend on our sources. And the reporters who do very well and get the, quote, scoops are the reporters who develop very good relationships with their sources. And they keep on top of things that way. And it's not always as formal as a press release. Sometimes it's just a phone call. And someone will call and say, hey, Michelle, this is happening on Tuesday. Thought you might want to know about it. Or this is happening next week. Or we're going to put together our end of the year report 2 months early, and we can give you a look at it a little bit earlier than we thought you could. And it's those kind of informal contacts that help us keep on top of the city. But press releases are the things that let us know what we do each day. At 7 o'clock every morning, an editor puts together a menu of the news for the day. We call it either a menu or a schedule. And she does that by doing 3 things. She looks at a file that we have called, I don't even know what it is called, but it's a file that we have of all things that are coming up. For instance, if I do a story today, and I do something that the Streets and Sanitation Department has decided to do something, and it's a preliminary report, and they're going to make the final decision 2 weeks. Well, that will automatically go in the August 14th file or the August 15th file, and then on that day, when she pulls the August 15th file, it will have that note and several others, so she knows what's going on for the day. The second thing is she looks at all the press releases for the day, and that helps her put together her menu. And the third thing is just the phone calls and the television reports and the radio reports and the spot news that come in from the day. And press releases that we go through every day is a stack. It's not even that big. It's more like this. It's literally this big, because we get press releases from all over the city, from beyond the city, from downstate. And so when you write a press release, you have to remember that you're competing for the editor's attention. And the biggest problem in looking at press releases is that people who write the releases don't get the information right at the top of the press release. You usually have to read 3 or 4 graphs, and then you say, okay, this is what they're talking about. And what you want to do right away, right in the very first paragraph, if you can, grab them right away and tell them, this is what we're doing, this is why we're doing it, this is when we're doing it, and this is how we're doing it, and this is who to contact if you need more information. And then go back and then with the rest of the release, then support that information. A lot of people try to do cute things at the beginning, or use an anecdotal lead or a scenario. And that sometimes can grab your attention, but when you're on deadline and you're trying to get the paper out, you just don't always have the time to go all the way into the press release. And so what you have to do right away is get the editor's attention, and then the editor will pass that release on to the reporter who's going to cover the story, and the reporter has time to get into the release more. Sometimes what some organizations and agencies and public relations firms do is they will, at the top, they'll just spell it out. And it'll say who, colon, this person, what, colon, this event, where, colon, this time. And it's just, it's right there, and it's very easy to understand, and so you know what you're dealing with. Press releases should always have a contact person if you're sending out a release. And that contact person might be you, if you're planning an event, or it might be a person who is more familiar with something that you're doing. Say you're sending out, you're working in a school district and you're having a district-wide science fair. And you're working with several high-tech companies, and one of the high-tech companies has donated a personal computer, and you're going to give away $15,000 in scholarships, and it's really a big thing. Well, you might not be the person putting that fair together, so that the reporter could get in touch with you, but if that's not the case, you'll likely have to put the reporter in touch with someone else. So you might want to put the name of the person who's organizing the fair and give them enough support information where they can go in and sell the story. Either sell the story to the editor, or the editor will have enough faith in the press release that he or she will think it's something worth doing. When you send press releases to the paper, you're not always sending them blindly, just sending them to the Chicago Tribune, 435 North Michigan. Many times you will send them to a reporter that you're familiar with, or you'll send them to the education reporter, or one of the team of education reporters, or you'll send them to, for instance, I am not an education reporter, but Steve knows who I am. If something happens at Salcedo, perhaps he'll send something to me because he's familiar with me. If you're sending a press release to a reporter directly, you almost always have a better chance of getting that person's attention because the reporter isn't going through a stack of this many press releases every day. And which leads me to my next subject is developing a good rapport with the reporters that you're familiar with. It's really important. Most of the stories that I have, when I was covering education, most of the stories that I did that I felt really good about weren't the stories that I did that came from press releases or came from just going to the school board meetings again and again. Most of them came out of meeting with the superintendent over lunch, or going to a teacher's workshop and just sitting down and talking to people and listening to what they were saying, and you get really good story ideas from that. And when I first started, I covered education in Inglewood. Now, I don't know how many of you are familiar with Inglewood. Its claim to fame is it's where the Lakers play. It's where the Forum is. And when I first started covering education there, most of the teachers and the superintendents were, it was like there was this fear of reporters. They saw us as bad people, and we were going to go in and we were never going to say anything good. We were only going to point out all the problems in the school district. And I'm not saying that that's what many of you feel, but it was difficult for me because I depended on them to do my stories. I needed my sources to get information. And if they wanted to get information out to the public, in a sense, they depended on me to help them get that information out there. And it took a long time for us to develop a relationship, but once we did, what I tried to do, and what I found they often did, is just call me and say, let's go to lunch every now and then. Or to just a phone call. And sometimes to call someone, even when you're not looking for information. You know, just call and say, I was thinking about you today, how are you doing? Or did you watch the Lakers game last week? Wow, wasn't it great? Just to keep a relationship going with the reporter. And sometimes you might work with an editor on occasion, but in a town like Chicago where the news organizations are so large and the structure, the hierarchy is so great, it's doubtful that you work with editors that often, but you will work with reporters. And a lot of times if you give a reporter a story idea in person, that story idea will move farther than it will if you just send them on a piece of paper, send them a press release and on a piece of paper let them know what's coming up. How many of you deal with reporters at all now in any way? Do you have any contact with them at all? Have you ever, how many of you would feel comfortable being interviewed? How many of you would feel uncomfortable being interviewed? Okay. Why would you feel uncomfortable?
I don't really know. I really feel it probably would depend on the subject matter.
Let's say that you are a principal of a school that is installing a state-of-the-art computer lab, and it's something that you're real proud of.
Well, if I was proud of it, I would have no trouble being interviewed or supporting it or, voicing my opinion. But if I was ashamed or didn't want to tell the whole truth, no, I would not want to be interviewed because I would have a hard time not telling the truth because I'm a truthful person.
Mm-hmm. You should always tell the truth.
And yet, if it would hurt the system, you really might not want to tell the truth. You want to live in, let's say, a gray world,
Mm-hmm.
which would be better for all concerned. So if you can't be upfront and truthful, I wouldn't want to be interviewed about something I didn't believe in.
Okay. You were going to say something.
Well, what I saw was in the the TV reporters particularly, it's so aggressive and they just put the mic in front of the mouth and they just asking. So that kind of image possibly makes many people very uncomfortable.
Mhm.
Reporters and reporters my perception of reporter is having a pipe and hair is all over and not like so neat and pretty. And,
Well, we get a bad rap from television and movies. Every time I see a movie and they show all the reporters shoving microphones in people's faces and yelling questions to them, I go, that's really not the way it is. I mean, it's that way sometimes, but most of the time it's not the way it is. And the informal setting that I was talking about, that's why I asked how many of you were uncomfortable with being interviewed. It doesn't have to be that, put on the spot interview. A lot of times it can be, you can interview someone over lunch. I've interviewed someone on a golf course. If I know someone is nervous, and if I know someone feels a little bit hinky about talking to the press, I'll go out of my way to try to get them in as comfortable as atmosphere as possible. I talked to one teacher who had a problem with gang members that were in her class, and she could not control them, and she had stood up and was one of the few teachers who had actually stood up to the gang, and when they came in her classroom, she said, you couldn't wear this and you couldn't wear that, and no red, no blue, no shoelaces, no bandanas. And they retaliated, and she really had a hard time. And it was a really tough interview, and she really didn't want to talk to me. And I wound up going to the hairdresser with her and having my hair done at the same time that she had her hair done, and we talked in the shop. And we felt very comfortable in the beauty shop because it was a real comfortable environment for her. Now, not that many people will do that and will do that for a story. And but sometimes, it doesn't always have to be going to a beauty shop, but there are ways that you can make people feel more comfortable. Some people feel better about talking in their office because they're surrounded by their belongings and they're sitting in their chair and they have the pictures of their family there in front of them. And, that's when they feel comfortable. But all the stories that we do aren't always happy stories, and they're not about computer labs. Sometimes we do stories and we have to ask very hard questions, and that might be what you were talking about. And those are the interviews that can be very difficult. And that is when a relationship, no matter how well you establish a relationship with a principal or a teacher or a school administrator or a public relations person, those are the kind of stories that are going to strain the relationship. You have someone who you depend on for information, And it's hard for the reporter also, because many times you become, you try to become, you remain objective, but you like this person and you depend on them and you have a lot of respect for them in the business. And you have to go to this person and you have to ask them, why is it that 40% of your seniors failed this year? And that's a tough thing to do. And how many of you would feel comfortable if you were a principal and 40% of the students in your graduating class had failed and the reporter came into you and wanted to talk to you about it? How many of you would feel comfortable in that interview? Would any of you feel comfortable in that interview? Would you all feel uncomfortable in that interview? But do you think that that's a situation that you can really just close your mouth and not talk about? I mean, eventually the parents and the community are going to learn either through the newspapers or by word of mouth, or just they're going to learn when only 60% of the students show up for graduation. They're going to figure it out somehow, and the parents are going to ask questions. And so no matter how bad the situation is, you really can't run away from it. And when you do run away from it, that's when it becomes harder.
Hopefully in that situation, though, you'd have some gains that you made that you could, surface and try and put that issue under that a little bit more. Like maybe the year before, 50% were at graduation, so you made a 10% gain.
Mm-hmm.
You had something that you could talk about to put the positive above the negative. I would try to have some kind of gain like that I could talk about in the interview.
That's a really good point. The people who do well under interviews, under pressure, are the people who, one, are just so cool, calm, and collect that they always do well under pressure. I mean, it's just part of their personality. They just are very confident, or maybe they're crumbling inside, but they really put on a good game face in an interview. Or the people who come to a tough interview prepared. When I go to an interview, I come prepared. I do my homework beforehand. Sometimes I'll have questions written in a little hidden place, or either just keywords, so I don't forget to ask a certain question, so I don't have to call back later on. So I know what to ask. I'll try to find out a little bit about that person to make the interview a little bit easier. For instance, if I had to interview you, I'd never met you before, and I have to come in and ask you why 40% of your students failed. Well, this might sound a little bit cheesy, but I might try to get a little bit of information on you. I might try to find out what your hobbies are, how long you've been at the school, what the school is known for. You have a championship football team. Well, that might be the way I go in and talk to you about that first, and maybe that will help break the ice a little bit, and then get into the interview. Once we get into the interview, I come prepared, but the people who, like the people who are, the other people besides the people who are always cool, calm, and collect, that do well in interviews, are the people who come to the interview as prepared as the reporters are, who come with their little fact sheet and say, okay, we had a bad year this year, but it's not as bad as last year was. Or we had a bad year this year, but we learned a lot from it, and next year this is what we're planning to do. Or we had a bad year this year, but I don't know if you realize all the things that happened in the school. I mean, the roof caved in for the month of February, and we were out of school for 4 weeks, and who come with that kind of information and can give that to the reporter, and that makes the situation a little bit easier. But in those tough situations, and no matter how tough they are, you want to run away from the press, and sometimes you will, and sometimes it'll work out. But schools they're a different animal. There's something that every paper I've ever worked for, and every news organization I've ever worked for, takes education reporting very seriously. Very seriously, because when you're dealing with education, you're dealing with the country's greatest resource. You're dealing with our children. And we recognize that the readers, the viewers, the listeners take education reporting very seriously, because they're reading about what's happening to their children every day. They're reading about the development of their children. And when we send out reader studies, it's always in the top 3. the things that people are interested in. They're very interested in education. And many times, what readers read in the newspaper is, readers get roughly 80% of the news about what goes on in their schools from the newspaper. They get some from the radio stations and some from the television stations, but roughly 80% of it comes from the newspaper, because the newspaper can show you graphs, whereas in television they're limited in time. They only have 30 seconds or maybe a minute and 30 seconds, but still, it's only a minute and 30 seconds. Whereas in the newspaper, we do takeouts, and we do the kind of pieces that Casey Bruckrow does with the academic decathlon, and we can look a little bit, we can dig a little bit deeper. The other 20% comes from all of you. It comes from parent-teacher meetings, it comes from meeting with the principal, it comes from school publications, whether their child brings home a school newspaper, or if the district publishes a district newsletter, or if they attend PTA meetings. But 80% of that information will come from reading the newspapers. And so your relationships with reporters are very, very important, because that reporter is a very important link to the parents in the community. And so when you're dealing with a real tough situation, it's hard to turn your back on it, because it sometimes can make it worse. And the reason I'm saying that is, if, going back to the example, 40% of the students at John Jones High School is ill. And I talk to some of the teachers, and the teachers tell me what they think the problem is. And the kids don't care. There's problems in the schools. There's gang problems and there's truancy problems, and a lot of the kids are doing drugs and whatnot. And we've also had morale is bad, or they cite a number of reasons. I talk to the children at the school, and the children have their own reasons. Oh, they think this, and they think that, and they think this. And I talk to some of the people, the support staff, the cafeteria workers and the janitors, who a lot of reporters don't talk to, but they're there all the time, and they know a lot, and they can usually tell you a lot, because, you know, they have big ears and they have big eyes, and they know what's going on in the school, and they have their idea. But then when it comes down to talking to the principal or the vice principal or the counselors, then you have to say, and the principal of John Jones High School declined to comment. Now, it's not that you're trying to give the principal a bad rap, but since the principal declined to comment, that's what you have to say. And you don't get a chance to tell your side of the story. And you don't get a chance to tell what you think went wrong, or what you think went right, or why you think what happened. And so even when it's tough, you have to deal with, you don't have to, but it's usually better to deal with this. Have any of you ever had a tough interview or a confrontational interview of any kind?
Reporting?
Or with a reporter, or with a boss, or with, in a work situation, not in a personal situation with a family member, but in a work situation?
Well, I didn't have one directly, but there was a situation in the district where I work where the superintendent declined comment, and the reporter came into the building and tracked down a non-tenured teacher who was kind of naive and asked a lot of questions, and then he was quoted. The teacher? Yeah, later in the paper. And there was a lot of feeling in the school about the reporter having had done that.
And what was the feeling?
Very negative.
And
I felt like that she had sort of somehow known that this particular person would be vulnerable to her. What we heard was that she really hit him with the questions over and over and over again.
Mm-hmm.
And it was like very negative feeling toward her. She sort of has a bare kind of name now with the teachers in the district,
Mm-hmm.
like a beware of feeling about her, not just among the teachers, but administration too. In fact, it came up just a couple of days ago. Her name came up. Just
Oh, really?
in context. It was like, oh, well, we'll let you call so-and-so.
That's a tough situation.
Yeah.
Because she had a job to do, and you might not understand, but when an editor sends you out for a story, sometimes your job depends on it, whether or not you get the story. I mean, we're word merchants, and we're out there to get information. And so she may have been thinking, oh, I got to get this story, I need my paycheck this month. Or she may have actually, really thought that this person had something to tell. Or maybe it was a situation where he actually had a story to tell and wanted to get the story out and felt comfortable, or felt that there's a story and it needs to be told, so I will tell you. It's hard because that kind of backlash can make a reporter's job difficult. Because I have a feeling that when she comes to talk to anyone in the school now, they probably,
Absolutely, absolutely. It's an undeclared, it's a cold war between her and the superintendent and the administrators.
Do you think that you can ever diffuse that situation?
Me?
Or no? Do you think that
It could be
they could
diffused?
mend relations?
I don't know, because what followed that was what we were told by superintendent administration was so much misquoting. There were subsequent stories that had to do with a resignation of a principal and a sudden resignation. And supposedly the articles that followed over the ensuing couple of weeks had many, many misquotes. So I don't know if it's repairable. I mean, you would know better if it's repairable.
Well, misquotations, that's another area.
But then the feeling was, too, we weren't sure if we were being told they were misquotes or whether they were, I mean, that was the interesting thing about it, was that actually the teachers wanted the story to get out, but they felt negative about the way she had gone about it. Because they wanted that story out. We were dying for it to be out.
I had one, last year I was the head coach for volleyball at the high school. And we made it to the regional playoffs, and we lost. We were ahead and lost. And the first question the reporter asked me when it was over was, Coach, is part of the reason you lost is because it's your first year. And I hadn't had public relations yet, so I wasn't ready to tell my story, and I blew it totally. And I went home that night, and I had a perfect speech ready, but it was too late.
Right.
And I just, part of it was, I think that was an awful question for him to ask me in the heat of the moment, but I wasn't ready. I wasn't prepared for a reporter to talk to me at the end, and I should have been.
To tell you the truth, it's a question that had to be asked.
And I had my answers, but I wasn't.
But there are ways to part of that is just savvy. It's just knowing how to ask someone a very difficult question in a way so that you don't have to, stomp them out when you do that,
I just wasn't ready for it.
Because she had told him, right now is not the time, I'll talk to you about it tomorrow, because she had done that.
You could have done that, but I can tell you what he probably would have said.
What?
Well, my deadline is at 5:30, and the paper will be out tomorrow morning, so, I would like to wait till tomorrow, but I can't. I mean, that's probably what he would have had to say. In a case like that, you may have wanted to say, listen, the game, we just finished. Let me go in the locker room and take a shower. I'll meet you in a half an hour. And maybe you have a chance to go and get yourself together and think about what you want to say.
In that same sense, when there's 2 or 3 reporters from different papers at a sporting event or a school board, when the superintendent's done speaking, they all ask him a question. How is it when he just answer anyone he wants? Or do people pick up on other people's questions? Did you take someone else's question if they answer it? Like say that sometimes reporter asked a question, well, that question, is it because your first year? And he answered it, could you use that in your paper
Yes,
too?
you could, because it was said publicly. And that often happens at, have any of you ever attended a school board meeting? Okay, do you know if the reporters surround the superintendent or surround a board member afterwards, they're all barking out questions. And if one asks a question and say the superintendent says something, well, everyone writes down what the superintendent says. It's, you don't just write down the retorts to your question. Anything you say then would be, it's like television. Everyone uses the same clips. You see the same statement on all three networks. If you do have to do something that you don't want to do, if you have to have a bearish interview and you're just not ready for it, it's better for you, and it's probably better for the reporter to just say, listen, it's not that I don't want to talk to you, but I'm just not ready to talk to you right now. I mean, can we do it at 1 o'clock? Let me get something in my stomach, or let me have a cup of coffee, or just let me think about what I want to say. In a situation like that, like your situation with dealing with the reporter after the game, you know, you're dealing with so many other things. I mean, your team is probably, you know, asking you questions, and you're trying to make sure they all get back to the locker room, and the parents and everything else. And to keep control of that situation, you may just say, can you talk to me after we come out of the locker room? One of the complaints that I got most when I was an education reporter is, Michelle, why do you always write bad things? Can't you find anything good to say about the school system? And I've talked to several education reporters. Education reporters get the same. Well, police reporters get the same thing. Can't you ever find anything nice to say about, you know, like, we're here to protect and to serve? I mean, can't you think of anything nice to say? The problem there is that the bad things that happen in the district usually are so obvious. Well, that's not always true, but they're usually things that come up at board meetings, or come up at teachers' meetings, or are just obvious to the human eye. Well, the school's covered with graffiti. Everyone can see that it's covered with graffiti. You know, that's something that everyone can see. Drugs. After a while, they start to manifest themselves if they're in the school. I mean, that's the kind of things that people can see. A reporter can go in and look for the good stories, but oftentimes the good stories, the unsung hero stories, the teacher who stays there till 6 o'clock every night making paper mache gifts to give to children who do well, or the teacher who, you know, really, or the teacher who gets there at 6 o'clock every morning to work with one student who has a speech impediment who wants so bad to be an actor. But I mean, and there's stories like this. Now, I'm not going to know that because at 6 o'clock in the morning, I'm in the shower, you know, and I'm not going to know about the teacher who stays after school because at 6 o'clock at night, I'm on deadline. The only way I'm going to know those stories if you tell me. If you tell me, you know, gee, there's a teacher at our school who, and these are, everything I've told you are cases that I've actually heard of. There's a teacher at our school who is so wonderful and is so nice that she gave a student $20 so he could get his hair cut. This is a student who came to school with wild hair every day, and everyone made fun of him and called him Wild Child. And they didn't know that he didn't get his hair cut because he couldn't afford to. Teacher found that out. She gave him money to get his haircut. That's a wonderful story. That's warming. And the thing is, that's the kind of story that people like to read. They read that stuff over breakfast and they go, gee, the world is wonderful after all. And that's the kind of story that we would like to print in the paper, but those things aren't so obvious to us. That's where we depend upon you. The student who last October was failing every single class, and this October is leading the class play and has, you know, aced all his classes and has done this in a matter of 8 months because he had help from so-and-so. That's where public relations is really important, and how you call and how you present that story. And if you know a reporter, it's easy. If you're used to dealing with someone, if you're used to dealing with Jane Smith, who writes for the Patriot Herald Ledger Tribune, you can call her up and you can just say, Jane, I've got a great story. But if it's someone that you don't know, the story's a little bit harder to sell because you have to call someone that you don't know, and then you have to tell them the story that you think is so wonderful and deserves to be on page 1 with a banner headline, and you have to get them to feel the same way you do. Now, in a case, let's use an example. The teacher who comes in early to work with a student. How would you sell that story to a reporter? You're dealing with a paper that you don't really have great press relations with, not because they write bad things, but just because you just don't deal with them that much. You know, their education coverage is basically limited to covering the school board, printing the lunch menus, and the high school football and basketball and baseball teams. How would you call and sell that story? Would you call or would you send a press release? First of all, do you think it's a story that's worth telling?
Yeah.
You do?
Anything that shows school in a positive light is worth just telling.
Okay.
Even if it's not accepted by the reporter, at least you're making the attempt to say, hey, we have submitted good material.
Okay.
You have rejected it.
Okay. So, but how would you submit it?
I would probably submit it in a press release form because I don't think it's important enough to call a reporter on to say, hey, this is an emergency situation.
Mhm.
And I know they would probably use it for filler if they needed something on a day that they were slow. It's not something that is an ultimate priority from the news reporter's standpoint.
It's not something that we would call time pegged.
Right.
Okay. If you sent a press release, would you follow up with a phone call?
I'm not sure on an article like that. If I felt the article was something really important, like if I was pursuing a bond issue, I certainly would.
Mhm.
If it was something I was just trying to promote as a positive image, I'm not sure if I would or not.
Okay.
If it was something like a new computer program or something that I think would have a great vast appeal or a great vast importance, I certainly would on the effect.
Okay. Anyone else have any ideas there?
I was just going to say that I think for community newspaper type publication, I think it would probably get in. Like the community where I teach, those kind of human interest stories, if they have the space, probably will get in. So for working in the suburbs or a smaller community, I think that you could follow up with a phone call and it would be fine. Go into looking for that. Not Chicago, I don't know.
I think because it is Chicago, I'd make a phone call, because they do have so many other bigger things to put in the paper. If I thought it was that important enough to write a news release or press release for it, I would spend a couple seconds on the phone call and say, just want to know if you received that press release on Miss Jones, who comes in and works with so-and-so for 2 hours every day before school and after school, and the progress he or she's made in the last 8 months is unbelievable. I just want to make sure you got that press release, that's all.
Mhm.
Real, not like put it in the paper, but just want to know if you received it yet.
Mhm.
It couldn't hurt. I don't think it would hurt. I don't know, maybe it would.
It would never hurt.
I don't think it would hurt just to say, just real quick, did you receive it? That's all.
If you send a press release to a person, it's almost always a good idea to make a phone call. If you send it to if you send it to a reporter, if any of you ever send me a press release, it's probably a good idea to give me a call. If you call me on deadline, I'll only be able to talk to you for a second. But it's probably a good idea to give me a call. Just because it helps, you know, a reporter gets so many press releases. And then the phone call comes, and the phone call does a few things. It says, this person really cares about this story. Maybe I need to take a second look. I mean, if they're already sold on the story, it'll only sell them harder. If it's something that they feel lukewarm about, yeah, there's a good story there, but gee, I'm working on this, and I'm working on that, and you know, September's right around the corner. I have to do my big back to school, you know, project and everything else. But then you get the phone call and you go, well, yeah, I'm going to take a second look at it. And what might happen if you send them a phone call, if you give them a phone call, is the reporter might think about it and think, well, okay, I might not have time to do it, but Michelle's on general assignment on Thursday night. Maybe that's something that she can pick up, since, you know, if the desk hasn't given her anything else. Or we have 12 interns this summer. This would be a great feature for an intern to do. And because the interns generally need those kind of features to round out their clips. And the interns who come to work for the Chicago Tribune tend to be very, very good reporters. They're very impressive. And so if the education reporter can't do it, or the editor might, if the education reporter might do it, they might pass it on. But the phone call always helps. And if the desk heard me say this, they'd probably say, oh no, Michelle, now we're going to be inundated with phone calls. But it does help.
What about pictures with something like that, or a picture, or is that something that...
Now that depends. I know community papers will sometimes accept pictures. For instance, if you had an event and you had a photographer there and you took pictures and you sent the paper the picture, they might use it. The Tribune has a policy, and any union paper also will have a policy that they have to use their pictures. They can only use their pictures unless it's a mugshot. For instance, you have a new principal. when the new principal comes in, he goes to a photo studio and he gets his makeup done and he gets the lighting just right and it's touched up and it's, he has everything but a halo around his head. And those are the press pictures that he used. We might use something like that, and occasionally you'll see mug shots like that, particularly of politicians. But for the most part, it depends on the size of the paper you're dealing with. Getting back to getting the good news out about the school, I noticed something that was in Can a Reporter Be Your Friend, and I think the answer to that question is yes. I think that there's a good point made in there about putting together a list of story ideas. For instance, September is coming up. Well, does school start in September or August here? September? Okay, and some August?
There, some city September.
Okay.
After Labor Day.
Oh, we're not going to talk about that.
The private schools, it's August.
It's August, okay. Well, at the beginning of the school year, it's a really good time to look ahead and to say, okay, what new programs do we have? Oh, we have the new computer lab, and we have a new gifted reading program, or gifted and reading program. We're making these changes in the bilingual program. We've had these demographic changes in the school. We've realigned the boundaries, and we now have for instance, 40% Latino population, so we're kicking off a new bilingual program, and we're making these changes and those kinds of changes. And it's a real good time to look at what's coming up for the year and to put together a list. Now, when I covered education, I used to meet with the superintendent, and it would irk me a little bit, but then I started to appreciate it because we would meet every 2 weeks. And we would meet in his office, and we'd talk about what was going on. And this was a real hot period. Ooh, this was a hot period. I mean, all kinds of things were going on. One of the board members was on trial for embezzlement, and another board member had openly called for the ouster of 2 of the principals in the school district. And it was just a real hot period. And so in order to make sure that we kept some sort of, bond through this, we would meet regularly. And he would often yell at me when I came in, why do you always write bad news, Michelle? And it was his right, and I would let him yell because, I respected what he did. And after a while, he respected what I did, but it was because we met on a regular basis. And we talked about the issues, and it was good for me because it gave me a chance to ask him the hard questions that I had to ask in a setting that we were very comfortable with. Well, he would also come in with a list every time we met. Okay, Norris, you want good news? This is what's going on. And he would give me a list. These are 10 good things that are going on in the school. And he would, give me this list. And it got to the point where I had no excuse for not knowing good stories. I mean, he would give me stories about the band held 8 car washes. This is the truth. The band held 8 car washes for 8 consecutive weekends so they could all get new uniforms. You just can't, if someone is feeding you this kind of stuff and literally giving it to you, or almost giving it to you on a silver platter, you cannot not accept it. And maybe you don't have to meet as often as we did, but it's a good idea to put together those ideas so you have something to sell when you do meet. And then if you're working with a press officer, you have something to give the press officer, and you can say, these are the kind of things that are coming up. You might want to send a release. You might want to call someone, and and this is something. But in doing that, when you put together your list, the one thing that the superintendent I was working with would do is put together only good things, which is, if I gave you a list of stories that I'd want you to write about me, I'm sure I'd give you 10 good things. I wouldn't, give you anything bad. But when you do the list, you might not want to give the reporter anything bad, but what you might want to do is in your own head, for yourself, note, okay, these are the things that are coming up that might be a problem that the reporters might pick up on in the future. And you might not have to give the reporters that, but when you're putting together the list of upcoming things, you should at least do that for yourself so you're preparing yourself for what's coming up. And it's a good time to go back and look at the list every so often during the year so you know what's coming up.